one, and then yeah, I can do that. Okay, so
Yeah.
let
So
me.
thank you for having us. Um, as Sanmai is pulling this up, we're going to give a quick overview of stuff that we've been working on um, that has been, I guess, 8 years in the making. So we've been involved in a uh, ongoing community partnership to improve homeless services in the St. Louis region. Um, and the title of our talk is Sanmai's pun about justice resource allocation. So everybody laugh hard because I've worked on that really hard. Go ahead and advance. So in terms of justice, we do want to talk about ways that we should and should not consider how to allocate scarce resources. So we are rooted in a longstanding history of economics research, longstanding history of philosophical debate of how do you deal with these scarce resource allocation problems. And in our context today, what we're talking about is homeless services, where we have, it's just hard. It's hard to determine who should get what when you have so many competing interests and from multiple levels. So go ahead, Sanmay. I think you probably all know this, given your work in LA, but so homelessness is guided by federal policy. Every community in the country is required to set up a system to respond to emergency housing needs. We've gone through many iterations of how these services are organized, and we're still struggling. So we have a lot of people who need help without enough resources to provide it. And as this is another Sanmai term, it's a base problem where this is a thing that we need to do. We need a house as a platform. So to improve public health, we need to address housing stability. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, so I already said this. One thing to point out that the typical homeless system is offering a variety of services that range from emergency shelter, so I don't have a place to stay right now, to emergency short-term assistance, like 1 month's rent or a couple months rent, to even longer-term housing supports, ongoing housing subsidies. So there's a range of options. People prefer some over others. Go ahead, Sanmay. The work that we're going to be talking about is it was in our last economic recession. So this is work done right after the Great Recession, where homeless services had reorganized itself to offer these basic supports. So emergency shelters, transitional housing is a 24-month, up to 24-month supportive housing option. Rapid rehousing is time limited in St. Louis. It was more like 3 months of supportive housing. And then homelessness prevention, which was really light touch services. So this was the 1 month's rent, the help moving in, the utility deposit. And what is unique about St. Louis is at the time we had a central system. So this is, folks know coordinated entry. This was how coordinated entry should have been done, where you have a single entry point for all housing responses, not just those that met certain criteria. And what it gave us the ability to do is kind of track community-wide demand. So we're using data we can see community-wide who's coming in and out of the system. Go ahead, Sanmay. So we've got in our time period, so 7-year time period, 14,000 households. We have reentry, which, if you look at this, you see homelessness prevention. So 14% of those who received homelessness prevention returned or needed assistance, requested assistance within 2 years. And you think, well, that's great. Homelessness prevention should be really good. Way better than emergency shelter, where the return rate was 43%. But these are, of course, biased. So these are unadjusted reentry rates. And so we've got this problem where we've got to figure.
Patrick, you're getting cut off every now and again.
Yeah, sorry. So we've got this challenge of who do we provide assistance to that will benefit both the individual household as well as the system-wide availability of resources. Go ahead, Sanmay.
All right, so I think this is the point at which I will take over. So I'm going to talk I want to talk about sort of a couple of different things that were kind of inspired by this framework that we then began to work on. Some of this basic stuff I talked about when Phoebe had last invited me over to USC a few years ago, which was a really great visit and spurred some of the thoughts that have gone into this research since then. But essentially, I guess the first problem that we got interested in when we were looking at this data was this question of just, okay, within the limits of the system and those people whom it managed to actually support at the time, are there potential efficiencies to be gained by doing a better job of matching households to services, right? And so the simple sort of cartoon way to think about this is in this kind of picture. So suppose you've got green are households and red are services, right? The empirical question is going to be sort of, are there gains to be had? And I've got sort of two opposite ends of the spectrum over here in a really simple version, right? So think about these numbers as sort of positive utility values, right? In the first, in this slide in the part on the left where it says homogeneous, what we've got is we've got two resources. One of them is a value 3 resource and the other one is a value 8 resource, and that is the case no matter who gets assigned to that resource, right? So this is a situation where, let's say, transitional housing is a very powerful support and it's a powerful support for everyone, and therefore whoever gets matched to the transitional housing resource will do better and whoever gets matched to emergency shelter will do worse. At the other end, we might have significant heterogeneity in how people respond to these different types of resources. And there's a lot of evidence from that, especially from Patrick's prior work on prevention, that there are, households who we may be sort of, giving too intense services to, and they would actually be better off if we let them make their own decisions with appropriate sort of levels of support. And so here's an example where, for example, if I went with the straight match over here, I would get a social welfare of 6 by matching the top agent to the top resource and the bottom agent to the bottom resource. But if I went with the diagonal match, I would actually end up getting a social value of 16, which is much higher, obviously, in this case, because it just turns out that the top agent is better matched with the bottom resource and vice versa. Right, so obviously this is a cartoon. It's really an empirical question of does this exist in practice, and if so, how much? And that was kind of the first set of questions that we were interested in exploring. And so we began to think about this as an assignment problem, right? For those of you from the AI and OR, you've seen many assignment problems, but again, to give you just a really simple value, suppose we've got 3 different interventions. And we've got, intervention 1 has capacity 1, intervention 2 has capacity 2, and intervention 3 has capacity 1. Then we can assign sort of one agent. This is sort of the efficient assignment, right, that maximizes overall kind of social utility in this kind of a case. So we're going to think about it in that manner. And so these are fairly recent results that are going to bring into question, right, can we use this data set that we've accumulated to try and actually figure out, these counterfactuals of how well matched is a household to a particular intervention. And so the question that arises over there is sort of, that obviously we've got this massive sample selection bias that Patrick talked about. And what this is, and why this is different from other work, that's been done in recent years on this kind of machine learning combined with assignment problems kind of thing is the other sort of famous example where this has been used recently is in refugee allocation, especially in European cities. The big difference over there is that they have essentially quasi-randomized data on prior allocations. Right, so they've basically prior allocations of refugees were randomized, and so by applying machine learning techniques to that, you can be pretty sure that you're able to kind of do a decent job of predicting how well a particular household will do when it's assigned to a particular city. We don't have that because obviously there's this massive selection bias in where caseworkers were assigning people in the past, right? So what we did was we examined various different machine learning algorithms with the idea that what we wanted to use was one that's good at counterfactual prediction. And there's some evidence that this method called BART, Bayesian additive regression trees, is a good method for counterfactual prediction. And so we did some analysis that basically showed that not only, does it have that theoretical benefit, it's actually as good as most of the other standard machine learning techniques you would use, like gradient boosted trees, on the standard kind of out of sample machine learning metrics for prediction on sort of, how well do families do when they're put into particular interventions. So this kind of grounds our decision to use BART. And just to, I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'll kind of run through some of those results a little bit. But basically, we showed that if we were able to re-optimize the allocations using these BART counterfactual predictions of how well households would have done, we can reduce our overall re-entries from 27.5% down to 21.5%, right? Which is actually pretty substantial, because even if you were to give each household the best intervention without worrying about capacity constraints at all, the best you could do would be to get like 18% predicted re-entry within the next 2 years. So we're able to sort of cut, a fair amount. We're able to cover a fair amount of that gap between the best that we could possibly do with no capacity constraints and what we're actually observing in practice. So that's kind of exciting and points the way towards interesting work. I want to talk briefly about the considerations of justice and equity. So we looked at sort of who is helped and hurt in this reassignment, and we find that about 40% of households are helped. That is, they have a lower reentry probability, but we're still, it's not Pareto improving. In order to do that, we're hurting 28% of households. Interestingly, we found that the ones that we're helping more are ones with lower monthly incomes, longer waits, more calls to the hotline, or where the head of the household has a disabling condition, which implies that actually, the more vulnerable households are potentially being helped more in this reallocation process. So that was kind of exciting. In work that we've been doing recently, we've actually been trying to sort of, put this into a more formal framework and connect it to work in political philosophy that looks at how local institutions allocate scarce resources. And basically in this case, one way to think about it is there's this particular set of allocation mechanisms that use notions of individuals and the interventions that they're assigned to. And I won't go through all of this in detail. I'm happy to talk about it more if anyone's interested, right? But the two that have been studied a lot are obviously the utilitarian or the efficient assignment, which we talked about earlier, and sort of the Rawlsian or, max-min notion that is often in CS and OR formalized as leximin these days, right? Which is to say, okay, you maximize the minimum utility and then subject to that, maximize the minimum of the remaining and so on and so forth. And we're actually investigating a third alternative that John Elster talks about, which is the so-called increment criterion, which says you should prioritize those who can benefit the most, which actually turns out to be different from either of the other two ideas that we've just talked about. It's essentially, it's leximin over regret, if you like to think about notions of regret in machine learning. And it's been used in situations like battlefield triage, for example, or people were talking about this a bunch when we were really worried about intensive care units and ventilators in the first sort of COVID wave and who should be allocated these kinds of resources. So there's the same idea of a different prioritization scheme. And if you look at that, it actually turns out that, while it's distinct from the efficient scheme, it actually typically comes closer to efficiency than it does to leximin, which might sort of help to explain to some extent why it has been a political choice to use that notion of prioritization in the past. And so we're interested in sort of thinking about what this idea of prioritizing by incremental gain might tell us about notions of who should get what in these kinds of situations, as compared to say VI SPDAT or something like that, which really prioritizes by most vulnerable first, which you can think of as more like Lexamin. These are the main takeaways that I've talked about. I won't go into detail because I want to give Patrick sort of a minute to come back in to just talk about our last slide, which is on ongoing work that we're doing. So take it away, Patrick.
Yeah, I just want to real quick emphasize that this is an ongoing community collaboration, and so what we're not talking about is all of the checks and balances that we've created with our community partners to understand what we're finding, and unfortunately, the COVID economic recession has kind of it's a blast from the past. It's deja vu, where we are supporting St. Louis in really tough decisions about rental assistance, which there has been $50 billion allocated in federal rental assistance for low-income households as part of the 3 stimulus packages. And just to put that in context, the normal homeless budget is about $2 billion. So this is a huge increase. And communities have little capacity to make these timely matches. And it raises really big concerns that if we're not doing this better, we're gonna miss opportunities to help a lot of families and waste a lot of resources very quickly. So we are in a good position to help in thinking through this through. So it's just been a really fun partnership.
Awesome, thank you. Virtual round of applause. Thank you both, Sanmay and Patrick. We have a few minutes for some questions. I guess I'm technically kind of moderating the questions, so I can read them to you both. And again, I encourage anyone in our audience, if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A box so that we can field them. So Dan Ho in the chat says, really interesting work. One of the open questions with the refugee matching work, which maximizes labor market integration, is that it may reward local labor market discrimination, i.e., don't send certain refugees to a particular city because of bias. He's curious whether there are similar concerns here in your work.
I think that's a really interesting question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would be similar because, I mean, at some level, that's sort of a locality that's making a decision, right? In our context, what we're thinking about is homeless service providers and sort of other resources that could be provided that are always kind of in the business of trying to serve their communities the best, right? Now, is there something insidious that could somehow come in? Basically, like and I don't know, Patrick's more the expert on this. I could imagine a situation where if different providers are being evaluated and compensated differently based on metrics that they're trying to optimize, like re-entry rate from your particular shelter or your particular intervention, I could actually imagine it in those cases potentially spurring bad behavior by trying to make them act in ways that would get them the populations that they want to minimize their re-entry rates. I mean, that would be the standard kind of concern, because it's a really, really interesting question. I would think off the top of my head that that's a little bit unlikely in this situation, but I will defer to Patrick on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's right now my biggest fear are landlords, where landlords are having a disproportionate decision-making process of whether they want to accept rental assistance for a household in need, or whether they want to maybe evict so that they can get the next family who has rental assistance. And I am very concerned about the unintended consequences of offering up rental assistance where we're not thinking through some of these insidious actors. So not exactly parallel, but when you flip the market, yeah, I think they're there.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have time just for one more question. So Eric Rice actually is wondering, or he is very interested in how the community partners understand what notions of fairness or prioritization is most desirable.
Yeah, so is this, yeah, so here's what I can say. So in our work, we started before coordinated assessment, and we started before the VI SPDAT. During our work, communities quickly figured out that they have to rush to the bottom. They need to find the most vulnerable and help the most vulnerable in order to get funding from HUD. And in that rush to the bottom, they recognized that they were not serving families very well. But that federal policy context still exists. Our work has given them a different language, I think. You know, our collaboration has created different language around, moving away from vulnerability and moving towards gain and equity. This has been, you know, we're continually having this conversation. We've not won over the purse string holder HUD, but we are doing our best.
I'll just add that sort of one of the things that has been really interesting to me in this is that, we got partly, I think, also inspired by some of the stuff that you guys have been doing and that, Phoebe has talked about and that Duncan McElfresh did with you guys, I think, on trying to sort of actually understand, what stakeholders' preferences would be, although in a slightly different context. And one thing that I found super interesting is just how at all different levels of the chain, ranging from, caseworkers and the people who are making the decisions on the ground, up to the community level sort of organization, up to the federal level, right? There's disconnects between their incentives at sort of each layer of this. And I think that that's part of what makes it really tough, right? Because everybody is locally responding to their incentives. And they may express their preferences in ways that are very locally responsive while still making the whole overall system very, very difficult to deal with. But this is something that I just find absolutely fascinating. And I would love to at some point talk more with you guys about this as well. So.
Yeah, and I'll end with a quote from a homeless consumer that was part of some of our work. The way that he put it was, teach a man to fish, or give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach me how to make the fucking rod. Yeah, I think this is, yeah, I'm going to end with that.
Yeah, what a wonderful way to end. Thank you both so much. What wonderful and important work that you both are doing. Thank you. Awesome. Another, virtual round of applause. All right. And with that, I suppose we will be moving